Good morning. Welcome back. We are on day 2 of book 2. Last we left them, they were getting ready for the impending war with Morgorath, and they think they got their battle plans from the one guy that was being attacked by the Warbles. And Galan, Halt, and Will were discussing something about going to Celtica, an old Celtic tradition, and they didn't know, and so Will's confused. Halt turned slowly to face his impulsive young apprentice and raised his eyebrows at the outburst. Will, subsiding, muttered, "Sorry, Halt," and the older ranger nodded. "I should think so. It's more than obvious that Galan is asking if I will release you to accompany him to Celtica." Galan nodded confirmation of the fact, and Will frowned, puzzled by the sudden turn of events. "Me?" he said incredulously. "Why me? What can I do in Celtica?" I think it's Celtica, or it might be Celtica, I don't know. The moment the words had left his mouth, he regretted them. He should have learned by now never to give Halt that sort of question. Halt pursed his lips as he considered the question. Ask interminable questions, interrupt your betters, and forget to do your chores, I suppose. The real question is, can you be spared from duty here? And the answer to that is definitely. Then why? Will gave up. They would either explain or they wouldn't, and no amount of asking would make Halt deliver that explanation a second sooner than he chose to. In fact, he was beginning to think that the more questions he asked, the more Halt actually enjoyed keeping him dangling. It was Galan who took pity on him, perhaps remembering how close-mouthed Halt had been when he chose with him. "I need you to make up the numbers, Will," he said. "Traditionally, the Celts insist that an official embassy be made up of 3 people, and to be honest, Halt's right. You're one who can be spared from the main effort here in Arielon." He grinned a little ruefully. "If it makes you feel any better, I've been given the mission because I'm the most junior ranger in the Corps." "But why 3 people?" Will asked, seeing that Galan at least seemed disposed to answer questions. "Can't one deliver the message?" Galan sighed. "As we were saying, it's a superstition among the Celts. It goes back to the old days of the Celtic Council, when the Celts and the Scoti and the Hibernians were one alliance. They were ruled, then, by a triumvirate." "The point is," Halt interrupted, "of course Galan can take the message to them. But if he's a sole messenger, they'll keep him waiting and fob him off for days or even weeks while they dither over form and protocol. And we don't have that sort of time to waste. There's an old Celtic saying that covers it. 1 man may be deceit, 2 can be conspiracy, 3 is the number I trust." "So you're sending me because you can do without me?" Will said, somewhat insulted by the thought. Halt decided that it was time to massage Will's young ego a little, but only a little. "Well, we can as a matter of fact, but you can't send just anyone on these embassies. The 3 members have to have some sort of official status or position in the world. They can't be simple men-at-arms, for example." "And you, Will," Galan added, "are a member of the Ranger Corps. That will carry a certain amount of weight with the Celts." "But I'm only an apprentice," Will said, and was surprised when both men shook their heads in disagreement. "You wear the oak leaf," Halt told him firmly. "Be cut bronze or silver, it doesn't matter. You're one of us." Will brightened visibly at his teacher's statement. "Well," he said, "when you put it like that, I'd be delighted to join you, Galan." Halt regarded him dryly. It was obviously time for the ego-stroking to end. Deliberately, he turned to Galan. "So," he said, "can you think of anyone else who's totally unnecessary to be the 3rd member?" Galan shrugged, smiling as he saw Will subside. "That's the other reason Crawley sent me here," he said. "Since Redmont is one of the larger fiefs, he thought they might be able to spare someone else from here. Any suggestions?" Halt rubbed his chin thoughtfully, an idea forming. "I think we might have just the person you need," he said. He turned to Will. "Perhaps you better get some sleep. I'll give Galan a hand with the horses, and then we'll go up to the castle." Will nodded. Now that Halt mentioned sleep, he felt an irresistible urge to yawn. He rose and headed for his small room. "See you in the morning, Galan." "Bright and early," Galan smiled, and Will rolled his eyes in mock horror. "I knew you'd say that." Halt and Galan bedded the 2 horses down and strolled through the fields toward Castle Redmont in companionable silence. Galan, attuned to his old teacher's ways, sensed that Halt had something he wanted to discuss, and before too long the older ranger broke the silence. This embassy to Caltica should be just what Will needs, he said. I'm a little worried about him. Galan frowned. He liked the irrepressible young apprentice. What's the problem? He asked. He had a bad time of it when we ran into those Wargos last week, Holt said. He thinks he's lost his nerve. Has he? Holt shook his head decisively. Of course not. He's got more courage than most grown men, but when the Wargos charged us, he rushed his shot and missed. Galan shrugged. No shame in that, is there? After all, he's not yet 16. He didn't run, I take it. No, not at all. He stood his ground. Even got another shot away. Then Tug took a hand and backed the Wargol off so I could finish it. He's a good horse, that one. He has a good master, Galan said, and Holt nodded. That's true. Still, I think a few weeks away from all of these war preparations will be good for the boy. It might get his mind off his troubles if he spends time with you and Horace. Horace? Galan asked. He's the third member I'm suggesting. One of the battle school apprentices and a friend of Will's. Holt thought for a few moments, and then nodded to himself. Yes, a few weeks with people closer to his own age will do him good, and after all, folk do say I can be a little grim from time to time. You, Holt? Grim? Who could say such a thing? Galan said. Holt glanced at him suspiciously. Galan was, all too obviously, just managing to keep a straight face. You know, Galan, he said, sarcasm isn't the lowest form of wit. It's not even wit at all. Even though it was after midnight, the lights were still burning in the Baron Erold's office when Holt and Galan reached the castle. The Baron and Sir Rodney, Redmont's battlemaster, had a lot of planning to do, preparing for the march to the plains of Youthal, where they would join the rest of the kingdom's army. When Holt explained Galan's needs, Sir Rodney was quick to see where the ranger's thinking was headed. Horace, he said to Holt. The small bearded ranger nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, it's not a bad... Sorry, it's not Holt. It's not a bad idea at all, the battlemaster continued, pacing the room as he thought it over. He has the sort of status you need for this task. He's a battle school member, even if he is only a trainee. We can spare him from the force leaving here at the end of the week, and... At this, he paused and looked meaningful at Galan. You might even find he's a useful person to have along. The younger ranger looked at him curiously, and Sir Rodney elaborated. He's one of my best trainees, a real natural with a sword. He's already better than most members of the battle school. But he does tend to be a bit formal and inflexible in his approach to life. Perhaps an assignment with 2 undisciplined rangers might teach him to loosen up a little. He smiled briefly to show that he meant no offense by the joke, and then glanced at the sword Galan wore at his hip. It was an unusual weapon for a ranger. You're the one who studied with McNeil, is that right? Galan nodded. The sword master, yes, that was me. Muttered Sir Rodney, regarding the tall younger ranger with new interest. Well, you might see your way clear to giving Horace a few pointers while you're on the road. I take it as a favor, and you'll find he's a quick learner. I'd be glad to, Galan replied. He thought that he'd like to see this apprentice warrior. He knew from his time at Redmont as Holt's apprentice that Sir Rodney wasn't given to overstating praise for any of the students in the battle school. Well, that settles it, Baron Erold said, anxious to get back to planning the 1,001 details of the march to Youthal. What time will you be leaving, Galan? As soon after sunup as I can, sir, Galan replied. I'll have Horace report to you before first light, Rodney told him, and Galan nodded, sensing that the meeting was over. The Baron's next words confirmed it for him. Now, if you two will excuse us, we'll get back to the relatively simple business of planning a war, he said. Chapter 3. The sky was heavy with sullen rain clouds. Somewhere the sun may have been rising, but here there was no sign of it, just a dull gray light that filtered through the overcast and gradually, reluctantly filled the sky. As the little party crested the last ridge, leaving the massive shape of Castle Redmont behind them, the new day finally gave in to the clouds, and it began to rain. A cold spring rain. It was light and misty, but persistent. At first, it ran off the riders' treated woolen cloaks, but eventually it began to soak into the fibers. After 20 minutes or so, all three were huddled in their saddles, trying to retain as much bodily warmth as they could. Galan turned to his companions as they plodded along, eyes down, hunched over their horses' necks. He smiled to himself, then addressed Horace who was keeping a position slightly to the rear alongside the pack pony Galan was leading. "Well then, Horace," he said, "are we giving you enough adventure for the moment?" Horace wiped the misting rain from his face and grimaced ruefully. "Less than I'd expected, sir," he replied, "but it's still better than close order drill." Galan nodded and grinned at him. "I imagine it is at that," he said, and then he kindly added, "There's no need to ride back there, you know. We rangers don't stand on certain ceremony too much. Come and join us." He nudged Blaze with his knee, and the boy mare stepped out to open a gap for him. Horace eagerly urged his horse forward to ride level with the two rangers. "Thank you, sir," he said gratefully. Galan cocked an eyebrow at Will. "Polite, isn't he?" he mused. "Obviously manners are well taught in the battle school these days. Nice to be called sir all the time." Will grinned at the kindly meant jibe. Then the smile faded from his face as Galan continued thoughtfully. "Not a bad idea to have a bit of respect shown. Perhaps you could call me sir as well," he said, turning his face away to study the tree line to one side so that Will couldn't see the faint trace of a grin that insisted on breaking through. Aghast, Will choked over his answer. He couldn't believe his ears. "Sir?" he said finally. "You really want me to call you Sir, Galan?" Then, as Galan frowned slightly at him, he amended hurriedly and in great confusion. I mean, sir, you want me to call you Sir? Sir?" Galan shook his head. "No, I don't think sir is suitable, nor Sir Galan. I just think one sir would do nicely, don't you?" Will couldn't think of a polite way of phrasing what was in his mind, and gestured helplessly with his hands. Galan continued. "After all, it'll do nicely to keep us all remembering who's in charge of this party, won't it?" Finally, Will found his voice. "Well, I suppose it will, sir." He shook his head, surprised at his sudden demand for formality from his friend. He rode in silence for a few minutes, and then heard an explosive sneezing sound from beside him as Horace tried unsuccessfully to smother his giggling. Will glared at him, and then turned suspiciously to Galan. The younger ranger was grinning all over his face as he eyed the apprentice. He shook his head in mock sorrow. "Joking, Will, just joking." Will realized his leg was being pulled again, and this time with Horace's full knowledge. "I knew that," he replied huffily. Horace laughed out loud, and this time Galan joined him. They traveled south all day, finally making camp in the first line of foothills on the road to Celtica. Around mid-afternoon, the rain had slowly begun to peter out, but the ground around them was still sodden. They searched under the thickest foliaged trees for dry, dead wood and gradually collected enough for a small campfire. Galan joined in with the two apprentices, sharing the work among the three of them, and they ate their meal in an atmosphere of friendship and shared experience. Horace, however, was still a little in awe of the tall young ranger. Will eventually realized that by teasing him, Galan was doing his best to set Horace at ease, making sure that he didn't feel left out. Will found himself warming to Halt's former apprentice even more than before. He reflected thoughtfully that he still had not a lot to learn about managing people. He knew that he faced at least another 4 years training before he finished his apprenticeship. Then, he supposed he'd be expected to carry out clandestine missions, gather intelligence about the kingdom's enemies, and perhaps lead elements of the army, just as Halt did. The thought that one day he would have to depend on his own wits and skill was a daunting one. He sighed. Sometimes it seemed that life was determined to be confusing. Less than a year ago, he had been a nameless, unknown orphan in Castle Redmont's ward. Since then, he had begun to learn the skills of a ranger and basked in the admiration and praise of everyone at Redmont Fife when he had helped the Baron, Sir Rodney, and Halt defeat the terrifying beast known as the Kalkara. He glanced across at Horace, the childhood enemy who had become his friend, and wondered if he felt the same bewildering conflict of emotions. The memory of their days in the ward together reminded him of the other friends, George, Jenny, and Alice, now apprenticed to their own craft masters. He wished he had had time to say goodbye to them before leaving for Celtica, particularly Alice. He shifted uncomfortably as he thought of her. Alice had kissed him after the homecoming dinner at the inn, and he still remembered the soft touch of her lips. Yes, he thought, particularly Alice. Across the campfire, Galan observed Will through half-closed eyes. It wasn't easy being Halt's apprentice, he knew. Halt was a near-legendary figure and had laid a heavy burden on any apprentice to him. There was a lot to live up to. He decided that Will needed a little distraction. "Right," he said, springing lithely to his feet. "Lessons." Will and Horace looked at each other. Lessons, said Will in a pleading tone of voice. After a day in the saddle, he was hoping more for his bedroll. That's right, Galan said cheerfully. Even though we're on a mission, it's up to me to keep up the instruction for you two. Now it was Horace's turn to be puzzled. For me? He asked. Why should I be taught any ranger skills? Galan picked up his sword and scabbard from where they lay beside his saddle. He withdrew the slender shining blade from its plain leather receptacle. There was a faint hiss as it came free, and the blade seemed to dance to the shifting firelight. Not ranger skills, my boy. Combat skills. Heaven knows we'll need them as sharp as possible before too long. There's a war coming, you know. He regarded the heavy-set boy before him with a critical eye. Now, let's see what you know about that toothpick you're wearing. Oh, right, said Horace, sounding a little more pleased about this turn of events. He never minded a little sword practice, and he knew it wasn't a ranger's skill. He drew his own sword and confidently stood before Galan, point politely lowered to the ground. Galan stuck his own sword point first into the soft earth and held out his hand for Horace's. May I see that, please? He asked. Horace nodded and handed it to Galan, hilt first. Galan hefted it, tossed it lightly, then swung it experimentally a few times. See this, Will? This is what you look for in a sword. Will looked at the sword unimpressed. It looked plain to him. The blade was slightly blued steel, simple and straight. The hilt was leather wrapped around the steel tang, and the crosspiece was a chunky piece of brass. He shrugged. It doesn't look that special, he said apologetically, not wanting to hurt Horace's feeling. It's not how they look that counts, said Galan. It's how they feel. This one, for example, it's well balanced so you can swing it all day without getting overtired, and the blade is light but strong. I've seen blades twice this thick snapped in half by a good blow from a cudgel. Fancy ones, too, he added with a smile, with engravings and inlays and jewels. Sir Rodney says jewels in the hilt are just unnecessary weight, said Horace, and Galan nodded agreement. What's more, they tend to encourage people to attack you and rob you, he said. And then, all business again, he returned to Horace's sword and took up his own. He returned Horace's sword. Very well, Horace, we've seen what that sword is good quality. Let's see about its owner. Horace hesitated, not sure what Galan intended. Sir? He said awkwardly. Galan gestured to himself with his left hand. Attack me, he said cheerfully. Have a swing. Take a whack. Lop off my head. Still, Horace stood uncertainly. Galan's sword wasn't in the guard position. He held it negligently in his right hand, the point downward. Horace made a helpless gesture. Come on, Horace, Galan said. Let's not wait all night. Let's see what you can do. Horace put his own sword point first into the earth. But you see, sir, I'm a trained warrior, he said. Galan thought about this and nodded. True, he said, but you've been training for less than a year. I shouldn't think you'll chop too much off of me. Horace looked to Will for support. Will could only shrug. He assumed that Galan knew what he was doing, but he hadn't known him long, and he had never seen him so much as draw his sword, let alone practice with it. Galan shook his head in mock despair. Come on, Horace, he said. I do have a vague idea what this thing is all about. Reluctantly, Horace swung a half-hearted blow at Galan. Obviously, he was worried that if he should penetrate the ranger's guard, he was not sufficiently experienced to pull the blow and avoid injuring him. Galan didn't even raise his sword to protect himself. Instead, he swayed easily to one side, and Horace's blade passed harmlessly clear of him. Come on, he said. Do it as if you mean it. Horace took a deep breath and swung a full-blooded roundhouse stroke at Galan. It was like poetry, Will thought. Like dancing. Like the movement of running water over smooth rocks. Galan's sword, seemingly propelled only by his fingers and wrists, swung in a flashing arc to intercept Horace's blow. There was a ring of steel, and Horace stopped, surprised. The parry had jarred his hand through to the elbow. Galan raised his eyebrows at him. That's better, he said. Try again. And Horace did. Backhands, overhead cuts, round arm swings. Each time, Galan's sword flicked into position to block the stroke with a resounding clash. As they continued, Horace swung harder and faster. Sweat broke out on his forehead, and soon his shirt was soaked. Now he had no thought of trying not to hurt Galan. He cut and slashed freely, trying to break through into that impenetrable defense. Finally, as Horace's breath was coming in ragged gasps, Galan changed from the blocking movement that he had been so effective against Horace's strongest blows. His sword clashed against Horace's, then whipped around in a small circular motion so that his blade was on top. Then, with a slithering clash, he ran his blade down Horace's, forcing the apprentice's sword point down to the ground. As the point touched the damp earth, Galan swiftly put one booted foot on it to hold it there. "Right, that'll do," he said calmly. His eyes were riveted on Horace's, making sure the boy knew that the practice session was over. Sometimes Galan knew in the heat of the moment the losing swordsman could try for just one more cut, at a time when his opponent had assumed the fight was over. And then, all too often, it was. He saw now that Horace was aware. He stepped back lightly from him, moving quickly out of the reach of the sword. "Not bad," said Galan approvingly. Horace, mortified, let his sword drop to the turf. "Not bad," he exclaimed. "It was terrible. I never once looked like—" He hesitated. Somehow it didn't seem polite to admit that for the last 3 or 4 minutes he had been trying to hack Galan's head from his shoulders. He finally managed to compromise by saying, "I never once managed to break through your guard." "Well," Galan said modestly, "I have done this sort of thing before, you know." "Yes," panted Horace, "but you're a ranger. Everyone knows rangers don't use swords." "Apparently this one does," said Will, grinning. Horace, to his credit, smiled wearily in return. "You can say that again." He turned respectfully to Galan. "May I ask where you learned your swordsmanship, sir? I've never seen anything like it." Galan shook his head in mock reproof. "There you go again with that, sir," he said, and then in answer, "My swordmaster was an old man, a northerner named McNeil." "McNeil?" Horace whispered in awe. "You don't mean the McNeil of Bannock?" Galan nodded. "He's the one," he replied. "You've heard of him, then?" Horace nodded reverently. Who hasn't heard of McNeil? And at that stage, Will, tired of not knowing what was going on, decided to speak up. "Well, I haven't, for one," he said, "but I'll make tea if anyone chooses to tell me about him." So that's where we're going to leave off, because the next chapter, we're going to learn about who McNeil is. Ooh, camera almost went. All right, have a good day.